The concrete floor felt like ice against my knees as I spread out the deflated air mattress in my son's garage. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night in March, and I could see my breath in the cold air. Paint cans and lawn mowers surrounded me like silent witnesses to what my life had become. I held a thin blanket in my trembling hands and stared at this makeshift bed that my own son had prepared for me. "You can sleep in the garage if you want, Mom. We need the guest room for Ashley's office." Those words kept echoing in my head. Brian had said them so casually, like he was offering me a choice between two perfectly reasonable options. Like sleeping in an unheated garage was just another way of saying, make yourself at home. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. 6 months ago, I was Susan Mitchell, a 58-year-old widow living in the cozy 3-bedroom house where I'd raised my son. I had my garden, my morning coffee routine, my book club with the neighbors. I wasn't wealthy, but I was comfortable. I was home. Then Brian called me sobbing. "Mom, we're going to lose the house. Ashley's business failed, and we're 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank sent a foreclosure notice. I don't know what to do. The kids will have to change schools, and we'll have nowhere to go." My heart shattered hearing my only child in such pain. Brian was everything to me after his father Robert died 3 years ago. He was my legacy, my pride, the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and promise he'd take care of me when I got old. "Don't worry, honey," I told him that day. "Mom will fix this." And I did. I sold my house in 2 weeks for $340,000. I signed over every penny to save his family. I packed up 30 years of memories into boxes and moved in with them, thinking it would be temporary, thinking I'd be welcomed, thinking my sacrifice would be appreciated. I thought wrong. Now here I was, inflating an air mattress next to Brian's workbench, trying not to cry as I heard my grandchildren's laughter drifting from the warm house behind me. Emma and Jake were probably getting their bedtime stories read to them in their cozy rooms, while their grandmother prepared to sleep among the spider webs and motor oil. The extension cord Brian had given me snaked across the garage floor to power a small lamp. He'd also handed me a space heater that looked like it belonged in a museum. "It gets pretty cold out here, but this should help," he'd said, avoiding my eyes. Ashley had stood behind him with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. I sat down on the concrete and pulled my sweater tighter around my shoulders. How had I gotten here? How had the woman who'd worked 2 jobs to put Brian through college, who'd sacrificed vacations and new clothes so he could have everything he needed, ended up being treated like an unwanted stray? 3 days earlier, I'd overheard Ashley on the phone with her sister. "She acts like she owns the place just because she helped us out. It's exhausting having her around all the time. I mean, we're grateful, but enough is enough." Grateful. That word stung worse than the cold air biting at my cheeks. I looked around the garage at the life I'd accepted, at the woman I'd allowed myself to become. But something deep inside me, something I thought had died with Robert, began to stir. This wasn't over. This wasn't how my story ended. I just didn't know it yet. Looking back, I realized I'd been living in a beautiful dream for the past 3 years. After Robert died from a sudden heart attack, I thought my world would crumble completely. But Brian stepped up in ways that made my heart swell with pride. He'd call me every Sunday morning at exactly 9 a.m., just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. "Morning, Mom. How's my favorite lady doing?" That's how he always started our conversations, his favorite lady. Those 3 words could carry me through an entire week. We had our routine, Brian and I. Every Sunday, he'd drive over with Ashley and the kids for dinner. I'd spend Saturday preparing Brian's favorite pot roast, the same recipe I'd used when he was growing up, and money was so tight I had to stretch every meal. Back then, I was working 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and watching Mrs. Henderson's kids during the day, just to keep us afloat after Robert's accident at the construction site. "Mom, you're my hero," Brian used to tell me when he was in high school, watching me fall asleep over my accounting books at the kitchen table. "I'm going to make it up to you someday, I promise." And he did make good on that promise. at least for a while. He graduated with his business degree, landed a solid job in marketing, and married Ashley, a sweet girl who seemed to genuinely care about making Brian happy. When Emma was born, Brian cried holding her in the hospital. "I want to be the dad to her that Dad was to me," he whispered, "and I want her to have a grandma like you." Those Sunday dinners were everything to me. Brian would always insist on doing the dishes while Ashley helped the kids with their coloring books. I'd watch him at my kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, and think about how proud Robert would have been. Our son had grown into a good man, a family man, someone who honored his commitments. "Sue, you've got the magic touch with this roast," Ashley would say, going back for seconds. "I keep trying to get the recipe right, but it never tastes like yours." "It's all about the love you put into it, sweetheart," I'd tell her, and I meant it. When Jake came along 2 years later, our Sunday gatherings got even more precious. I'd have both grandchildren climbing on my lap, begging for stories about their daddy when he was little. Brian would laugh until his eyes watered when I told them about the time he tried to help me bake cookies and ended up covered head to toe in flour. "Grandma Sue tells the best stories," Emma would announce, snuggling closer. I felt needed. I felt loved. I felt like the center of something beautiful and lasting. My little house on Maple Street wasn't much, just 3 bedrooms and a garden I'd tended for 20 years. But it was our gathering place. It was where memories lived. The kitchen table where Brian had done his homework. The living room where we'd watched countless movies together. The backyard where he'd learned to ride his bike. So when Brian called me that horrible Tuesday morning in February, his voice breaking with panic and shame, I didn't even hesitate. "Mom, I don't know who else to call. We're going to lose everything. The kids, Ashley, our whole life. It's all falling apart. I failed them. I failed you." "Brian, honey, slow down. Tell me what's happening." The bank sent a foreclosure notice. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. Ashley's boutique business went under, and my commission dried up. We owe $280,000 on the house, and they want it all. I've tried everything, Mom. Every bank, every loan company. Nobody will help us. I could hear Ashley crying in the background. I could hear my grandchildren asking their daddy why he was sad. "Don't worry, baby," I said, using the same voice I'd used when he was small and scared. "Mom will fix this." Because that's what mothers do. We fix things. We sacrifice. We save our children. I just never imagined it would cost me everything. The moving truck had barely pulled away from Brian's driveway when I rolled up my sleeves and headed to the kitchen. 3 days had passed since I'd signed over my house money, and I was determined to make myself useful while we figured out the living arrangements. After all, I was a guest in their home, albeit a temporary one. "I thought I'd start dinner," I announced cheerfully, opening the refrigerator. "Maybe that chicken casserole the kids always loved when they visited Grandma's house?" Ashley looked up from her laptop at the kitchen island, her fingers frozen over the keys. Her expression shifted from surprise to something colder, something that made my stomach flutter with unease. "Sue," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "you don't know where anything goes in my kitchen." The emphasis she put on "my" hit me like a slap. I stood there holding a package of chicken, feeling suddenly foolish and intrusive. "Oh, I'm sorry, I just thought—" "I have a system," Ashley continued, closing her laptop with more force than necessary. "Everything has its place. I can't have people moving things around and messing up my organization." I glanced toward the living room where Brian sat on the couch, his face buried in his phone screen. Surely he'd heard the tension in his wife's voice. Surely he'd step in and smooth things over like he always did during our Sunday dinners. But Brian didn't look up. He didn't say a word. He just kept scrolling, his thumb moving mechanically across the screen as if his mother wasn't standing in his kitchen being dressed down like a misbehaving child. "Of course, sweetheart," I said quietly, putting the chicken back. "I understand completely. Why don't you tell me what I can do to help?" Ashley's smile was thin and didn't reach her eyes. "I think I've got dinner handled tonight. Maybe you could just relax? Watch TV with Brian?" I nodded and retreated to the living room, settling onto the couch beside my son. He glanced up briefly, gave me a distracted smile, then returned to his phone. I sat there for 20 minutes, watching a cooking show, thinking about the chicken casserole I wasn't allowed to make in the kitchen I wasn't allowed to use. Later that evening, after the kids were tucked into bed, I approached Brian about my living situation. I'd been sleeping on their couch for 4 days, and my back was screaming from the uncomfortable cushions. "Honey, I hate to bother you, but I was wondering about setting up my room. I know you mentioned you were thinking about where I should go." Brian barely looked up from his phone. "Yeah, Mom. We'll figure something out. Give us a few days. It's just that my back is really bothering me on the couch, and I was hoping—" "I said we'll figure it out, okay?" His tone was irritated, dismissive. "Ashley's got a lot going on with trying to get her new business off the ground. We just need some time to think through the best option." A few days. That seemed reasonable. Every family needed time to adjust to new living arrangements. I was being too impatient, too demanding. After all, they'd just been through a financial crisis. Of course, they were stressed. But those few days turned into a week, then 2 weeks. Every time I brought up the sleeping arrangements, Brian would give me the same answer. "We're working on it, Mom." Meanwhile, Ashley's kitchen rules became more elaborate. I couldn't use the coffee maker in the morning because it was too loud. I couldn't open the curtains in the living room because it faded her furniture. I couldn't do laundry on weekdays because it interfered with her work-from-home schedule. Each rule was delivered with that same sharp smile, that same emphasis on ownership. This was her house, her kitchen, her schedule. And my son? He acted like he didn't hear any of it. I told myself it was temporary stress. New living situations were always challenging. We just needed time to find our rhythm. I told myself a lot of things in those first 2 weeks. Most of them were lies. By the 3rd week, I started to understand what it meant to be a ghost in your own family. It began with small things, almost too subtle to notice at first. When I'd try to contribute to conversations at dinner, Ashley would start talking over me to Brian about something urgent that apparently couldn't wait. When I'd offer an opinion about the news or share a story from my day, she'd check her phone with an exaggerated sigh, as if my words were physically painful to endure. "So, I was thinking," I said one Tuesday evening, "maybe this weekend we could take the kids to that new playground downtown." "Brian, did you remember to call the insurance company about the claim?" Ashley interrupted, not even acknowledging that I'd been speaking. "They said if we don't file by Friday, we'll lose our chance." Brian looked between us for a moment, then focused on his wife. "Yeah, I'll call them tomorrow morning." I sat there with my sentence hanging in the air, invisible. The worst part was watching my relationship with my grandchildren slowly being stripped away. Emma and Jake had always run to me when I visited, climbing onto my lap for stories and hugs. But now, every time I'd settle down to play with them, Ashley would materialize like a protective shield. "Emma, Jake, come away from Grandma," she'd say, in that sickeningly sweet voice she used when other people were listening. "She's tired. Why don't you go play in your rooms?" "But Grandma was going to read us a story," Emma would protest, her little hand clutching my arm. "Grandma Sue needs her rest, sweetheart. She's had a very long day." I hadn't had a long day. I'd spent most of it sitting quietly in the living room, trying to stay out of everyone's way. But Ashley had spoken, and the children would reluctantly trudge upstairs, leaving me alone with my hands empty and my heart aching. Brian's behavior became even more painful to witness. During his work-from-home video calls, he'd actually hold up his hand to shush me if I walked through the living room, the only common space I was allowed to occupy. Once, when I accidentally dropped a book, he turned to his laptop camera and mouthed "sorry" to his colleagues, as if my mere existence was an embarrassment he had to apologize for. "Mom, could you maybe stay in the kitchen during my calls?" he asked afterward. "It's just more professional." The kitchen where I wasn't allowed to cook. The kitchen where Ashley kept her ever-expanding list of rules posted on the refrigerator. "Please ask before using appliances." "Clean up immediately after yourself." "Respect the workspace of others." I started eating my meals standing up at the counter, afraid to sit at their kitchen table uninvited. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when I overheard Ashley on the phone with her sister. I was coming downstairs from using the bathroom when her voice drifted from the kitchen. "She hovers constantly, Karen. I can't even breathe in my own house. And the way she looks at me when I'm disciplining the kids, like I'm some evil stepmother or something." "Can't Brian talk to her?" Karen's voice was tinny through the phone speaker. "He's too guilty about the money thing to say anything. But honestly, I can't wait until she finds her own place. It's like having a disapproving mother-in-law watching your every move. Yesterday, she actually rearranged my spice rack because she said it wasn't organized efficiently. In my kitchen." I hadn't touched her spice rack. I'd barely touched anything in that kitchen. "Some people just don't know when they're overstaying their welcome," Ashley continued. "I mean, we're grateful for the help, but this arrangement was supposed to be temporary." I crept back upstairs, my chest tight with humiliation and confusion. Overstaying my welcome? I'd given them my entire life savings. I'd sold my home. I had nowhere else to go. But according to Ashley, I was the problem, and my son was too guilty to defend me. Memorial Day weekend arrived, and Ashley decided to throw a barbecue to celebrate Brian's recent promotion at work. "It'll be good for networking," she announced, bustling around the house with renewed energy I hadn't seen since before their financial troubles. I invited the Hendersons, the Martins, and a few people from Brian's office. I offered to help with the preparations, but Ashley waved me off with that familiar, tight smile. "I've got it handled, Sue. Why don't you just enjoy yourself?" So I sat on the back patio watching Ashley arrange everything perfectly while Brian fired up the expensive gas grill they somehow still owned despite their recent foreclosure scare. Their friends began arriving around noon. Couples I'd met briefly at Brian's wedding, polished professionals with their well-behaved children and designer casual clothes. I tried to blend in, making small talk about the weather and complimenting Ashley's potato salad. For a few hours, I almost felt normal again, like maybe this was just a regular family gathering where I belonged. Then Tom Henderson, Brian's colleague from work, settled into the chair next to me with his beer and a curious expression. "So, Sue, how are you liking living with the kids?" he asked warmly. "Must be nice having more time with the grandchildren." "Oh, yes, it's wonderful," I replied, though the words felt hollow. "We're still working out the long-term arrangements, but for now it's temporary." "Temporary?" Tom's eyebrows raised. "I thought you were looking for your own place. Brian mentioned you were apartment hunting." The conversation around us seemed to pause slightly. I felt several pairs of eyes turning our way, including Ashley's sharp gaze from across the patio. "Well, yes," I said, my voice smaller now. "I'm looking at a few options. It's just challenging to find something suitable on a fixed income." Tom looked confused. "Wait, didn't Sue just give you guys a fortune to save the house?" he asked Brian directly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet patio. The silence that followed was deafening. Brian's face flushed red as he fumbled with the grill tongs. Ashley's laugh cut through the air like breaking glass. "Oh, Tom, she's being dramatic," Ashley said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We offered her our garage. It's actually quite spacious and private. But apparently that's not good enough for some people." More laughter rippled through the group, but it felt forced, uncomfortable. I felt heat creeping up my neck as every face turned toward me with expressions ranging from pity to judgment to barely concealed amusement. "The garage?" asked Sarah Martin, Brian's supervisor's wife. "You want your mother to live in the garage?" "It's really very nice," Ashley continued, her tone suggesting I was being unreasonably picky. "It has electricity, and we could set up a space heater. Lots of people would be grateful for free housing, especially after being helped out so generously." The word grateful hit me like a physical blow. I sat there 60 years old, surrounded by my son's friends and colleagues, being publicly shamed for not being sufficiently thankful for the privilege of sleeping among the lawn equipment. Brian finally spoke up, but his words only made things worse. "Mom's got some specific needs," he said weakly, not meeting anyone's eyes. "She'll find something." I excused myself to use the bathroom, walking through their house on shaking legs. But as I passed the kitchen window, I heard Ashley's voice drift outside. "Some people are just never grateful," she was saying to a cluster of women. "We open our home, offer her a place to stay, and she acts like we're asking her to live in a cardboard box. I mean, my sister lived in her boyfriend's converted garage for 2 years and loved the privacy." I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. This was what I'd become, a charity case being discussed and dismissed by people who wouldn't exist in my son's life if I hadn't sacrificed everything to save it. The worst part wasn't Ashley's cruelty. It was Brian's silence. That night, after the last barbecue guest had driven away and the humiliation still burned in my chest like acid, I sat alone in the living room while Brian and Ashley put the children to bed. I could hear their muffled voices upstairs, probably discussing the day's events, probably talking about me. I was folding the throw blanket I'd been using on the couch when Brian appeared in the doorway, carrying something in his arms. In the dim light, it took me a moment to realize what I was looking at: a deflated air mattress, still in its plastic packaging, and a bright orange extension cord coiled neatly on top. "Mom," he said softly, not quite meeting my eyes. "We need to talk." My heart started racing, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the careful way he spoke, like he was approaching a wounded animal. Maybe it was how he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, the same nervous habit he'd had as a child when he'd broken something and was working up the courage to confess. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" Brian set the air mattress down on the coffee table between us and finally looked at me directly. "I know today was awkward with the whole garage comment thing. Ashley feels terrible about how that came across." I waited for him to continue, though Ashley feeling terrible seemed unlikely, given how she doubled down on her remarks after I'd returned from the bathroom. "The thing is, Mom, we really do need to figure out a more permanent solution for your living situation. And I know this isn't ideal, but we were thinking—" He gestured toward the air mattress. "The garage actually has electricity, and we can get you a space heater. It would give you privacy, your own space, and we wouldn't all be on top of each other." The words hit me like a slow-motion car crash. I felt each one individually before the full impact knocked the breath out of my lungs. "You want me to sleep in the garage?" I said quietly. It wasn't a question. "It's just temporary, until you find an apartment, or maybe look into some senior housing options. And honestly, it might be better for everyone. You'd have your independence, and Ashley could have her office space for the new business she's starting." I stared at my son, this man I'd raised, whose diapers I'd changed, whose homework I'd supervised, whose college tuition I'd worked double shifts to afford, and tried to find some trace of the little boy who used to promise he'd take care of me when I got old. "The garage gets pretty cold at night, Brian. That's why I got you a space heater." He pointed to a small, ancient-looking device sitting by the front door. "It's not too bad once it warms up. And look, this air mattress has great reviews online. It's supposed to be really comfortable." I nodded slowly, my hands folded in my lap. "I see you've put a lot of thought into this." "Mom, I know it's not what either of us expected when you moved in, but Ashley's really stressed about getting her business off the ground, and she needs that office space. She's been working so hard, and this could really be our fresh start after everything we've been through." Everything we've been through. As if I hadn't been the one to pull them out of their financial mess. As if I wasn't sitting there homeless because I'd given them my entire life savings. "Of course," I heard myself saying. "I understand completely." But I didn't understand. I couldn't understand how the child I'd sacrificed everything for could look at me, his own mother, and suggest I sleep among the lawnmowers and paint cans like some unwanted guest who'd overstayed her welcome. "It's just until you get back on your feet," Brian said again, and I could hear the relief in his voice that I wasn't fighting him on this. I wasn't fighting because I was too stunned to fight. But somewhere deep inside, in a place I thought had died with Robert, something small and fierce was beginning to stir, something that whispered, "This isn't over." The first night in the garage, I lay on the thin air mattress listening to mice scurrying somewhere in the darkness beyond my small circle of lamplight. The space heater Brian had given me wheezed and rattled like an old man's breathing, throwing off just enough warmth to keep me from freezing, but not enough to stop my teeth from chattering. I pulled Robert's old cardigan tighter around my shoulders, one of the few pieces of him I'd managed to pack when I sold our house. It still smelled faintly of his aftershave, though that scent was now mixed with motor oil and the musty dampness that seemed to live in the garage walls. By the third night, I'd developed a routine that felt like survival rather than living. I'd wait until I heard Brian and Ashley's bedroom door close upstairs before creeping into the house to use the bathroom and brush my teeth. I'd take a sleeve of crackers from the pantry, my dinner, since I was too embarrassed to use their kitchen for actual cooking. Then I'd retreat to my concrete cave, curl up under my thin blanket, and try to sleep while the house settled around me and my family lived their warm, comfortable lives just yards away. The cold was constant, seeping through the concrete floor and into my bones. My back ached from the unforgiving surface beneath the air mattress. My knees creaked when I stood up each morning, stiff from the dampness and chill. I started keeping a towel by my makeshift bed because the temperature changes made my nose run constantly. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional devastation that grew worse each day. On the fourth night, I sat on an overturned paint bucket at 3 a.m., scrolling through apartment listings on my phone. One-bedroom places for $2,200 a month, studio apartments for $900, all of them requiring first month, last month, and security deposit up front. All of them impossible on my $1,400 monthly Social Security check. I'd given Brian $340,000. $340,000 that represented 30 years of careful saving, of skipping vacations, and buying generic groceries and wearing the same winter coat for a decade. I'd handed over my entire future, and now I couldn't afford a place to live. The math was brutal and simple. I had $2,100 left in my checking account. After decades of financial responsibility, I was 2 months away from being completely broke. I started crying then, sitting on that paint bucket surrounded by garden tools and Christmas decorations. And once I started, I couldn't stop. The sobs came from somewhere deep in my chest, raw and ugly sounds that I tried to muffle with my hands because I couldn't bear the thought of my son hearing me break down. This was who I'd become, a 58-year-old woman eating crackers for dinner and crying alone in a garage because she had nowhere else to go. During the day, I'd sit in my car in various parking lots just to escape the garage and feel normal for a few hours. I'd buy a cup of coffee and make it last 3 hours at McDonald's, watching other families come and go, wondering how many of them would throw their mothers away like used furniture when it became inconvenient to love them. I thought about Robert constantly. What would he say if he could see me now? Would he be proud of the man he'd raised? Would he understand how I'd ended up sleeping on the floor of our son's garage like some homeless stranger? The worst part was the shame. I felt ashamed of my situation, ashamed of my neediness, ashamed that I'd somehow failed to raise a son who would honor his own mother. But mostly, I felt ashamed that I'd allowed it to happen. Sitting there on that fifth night, holding my phone and staring at apartments I couldn't afford, I realized I'd become invisible even to myself. I was disappearing, and nobody seemed to notice or care. On the sixth morning in the garage, I woke up with my hips screaming in pain and decided I couldn't live like this anymore. Not because I'd found some surge of strength or dignity, but because I was simply too tired to keep pretending this was acceptable. I needed to organize what was left of my life, to figure out what options I actually had. Brian had stacked my storage boxes in the corner of the garage, and I'd been avoiding them because seeing my entire existence reduced to 6 cardboard containers was too depressing to face. But that morning, sitting on my air mattress with a cup of instant coffee I'd made with water from the garden hose, I decided it was time to take inventory. The first box contained photo albums and Robert's awards from work. The second held my mother's china, pieces that would probably be worthless at a pawn shop, but had fed 3 generations of my family. The third box made me pause, a manila folder labeled Important Documents, in Robert's careful handwriting. I'd grabbed it during the rushed packing process, but hadn't looked inside. Insurance papers, I assumed. Maybe our marriage certificate. Things that seemed important to keep, but weren't immediately useful. I opened the folder and found exactly what I'd expected. Our marriage certificate, Robert's death certificate, Social Security cards. But underneath those familiar documents was something that made my heart skip. A life insurance policy from Robert's union job that I'd completely forgotten about. My hands trembled as I read the details. It was a separate policy from the one I'd already claimed, a smaller benefit that required a specific filing process I'd never completed because I was too overwhelmed with grief and the logistics of becoming a widow. The policy was worth $150,000, and it was entirely in my name. $150,000 that I'd never claimed because I hadn't known it existed. I stared at the paper until the numbers blurred, then read it again to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from sleep deprivation and despair. But there it was, in black and white, a lifeline I'd never known I had. Beneath the insurance policy was an envelope with Brian's name written across the front in Robert's handwriting. It was sealed with a note attached. For Brian's 30th birthday, love, Dad. Brian had turned 31 last month. I'd given him a sweater from Target and a card, feeling guilty that I couldn't afford something better. This letter had been sitting in our files for over a year, waiting to be delivered. I knew I shouldn't open it. It was meant for Brian, not me. But something about finding it in this moment, in this place where I'd been reduced to nothing, made me carefully peel back the envelope flap. Robert's familiar handwriting covered 2 pages, and as I read, tears started streaming down my face. Son, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and your mom has found this letter. I hope she waited until your 30th birthday like I asked, but knowing Sue, she probably gave it to you early because she can't stand keeping secrets. By now, you're a man with responsibilities of your own, maybe even children. But I need you to remember something important. Your mother sacrificed everything for us. She worked herself to the bone so you could have opportunities I never had. She gave up her dreams so you could chase yours. Take care of her, Brian. Honor her. She deserves to be treated like the treasure she is, not like a burden. Everything she did out of love. Make sure that love is returned with the respect she's earned. Your mother is the strongest woman I've ever known, but she shouldn't have to be strong alone. Love always, Dad. I sat in that cold garage, holding my husband's words and staring at a life insurance policy that represented a freedom I'd forgotten was possible. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than shame and despair. I felt powerful. I sat there for over an hour, reading Robert's letter again and again, feeling something shift inside my chest, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Each time I read his words, she deserves to be treated like the treasure she is, not like a burden. Another piece of the defeated woman I'd become started to fall away. When had I stopped seeing myself as a treasure? When had I accepted that sleeping in a garage was reasonable? When had I started believing that my own son's cruel bees and dismissals were something I deserved? I looked around at my concrete prison, at the paint cans and lawn equipment that had become my roommates, and for the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely angry, instead of just sad. Not the explosive kind of anger that burns out quickly, but a slow, steady flame that warmed me from the inside. Robert would have never allowed this. If he'd seen anyone, treating me the way Brian and Ashley had been treating me, he would have lost his mind. Robert, who used to get up early on Saturday mornings to make me coffee in bed. Robert, who would hold doors open for me even after 25 years of marriage. Robert, who introduced me to his friends as my beautiful wife Sue until the day he died. What would he think of the woman I'd become? The woman who said, "Of course, sweetheart," when told she wasn't allowed to use the kitchen. The woman who apologized for existing in her own son's house. The woman who'd accepted sleeping on a concrete floor like some discarded piece of furniture? I thought about the insurance money, $150,000 that nobody knew about, except me. That was enough for a nice apartment, maybe even a small condo. It was enough to start over with dignity instead of crawling through life begging for scraps of consideration from people who should have been honoring my sacrifices. But more than the money, Robert's letter had given me something I'd lost completely: perspective. I'd been telling myself that Brian was just stressed, that Ashley was protecting her territory, that this living situation was temporary, and I needed to be patient. I'd been making excuses for their behavior while accepting treatment that I wouldn't tolerate from strangers, let alone from my own family. No more. I stood up from the paint bucket, my joints protesting but my spine straightening with something I hadn't felt in months: resolve. I walked to the small mirror Brian had hung on the garage wall so I could get ready each morning, and I really looked at myself for the first time since moving in. The woman staring back at me had hollow cheeks and tired eyes, but she was still Sue Mitchell. She was still the woman who'd raised a child alone after her husband's accident. She was still the woman who'd worked 2 jobs and put herself through night school to get her accounting certificate. She was still the woman who'd paid off a mortgage and saved $340,000 through sheer determination and careful planning. "You're Robert's widow," I whispered to my reflection. "You're Brian's mother. You're Emma and Jake's grandmother. You're not a burden. You're not charity. You're not a problem to be solved." I folded Robert's letter carefully and slipped it into my purse along with the insurance policy. These weren't just pieces of paper, they were proof that I had value, that I had options, that I had a husband who'd loved me enough to want me protected even after his death. The fire that Robert had written about, the strength he'd seen in me, was still there. It had just been buried under weeks of humiliation and the desperate need to believe that my son still loved me. But love doesn't ask you to sleep on garage floors. Love doesn't make you invisible. And love certainly doesn't require you to be grateful for cruelty. I was done being grateful. It was time to remember who I really was. The next morning, I woke up on my air mattress with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. While Brian and Ashley went through their usual morning routine upstairs, coffee, showers, getting the kids ready for school, I quietly gathered the insurance documents and Robert's letter, slipped them into my purse, and told them I was going to the library to look for jobs online. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have work to do, just not the kind they expected. My first stop was the bank where Robert and I had kept our accounts for 20 years, the same bank where I'd closed everything out to give Brian his rescue money. Margaret Stevens, the branch manager who'd helped us with our mortgage years ago, looked genuinely shocked to see me. "Sue, how are you doing, honey? I heard about you helping Brian out with his house situation." That was incredibly generous. "It was the right thing to do," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "But I have a situation I need help with. I found some paperwork I'd forgotten about." I explained about the unclaimed life insurance policy, watching Margaret's expression shift from pleasant small talk to focused professionalism. Within an hour, we'd started the claim process, opened a new checking account in my name only, and scheduled a meeting with the bank's financial advisor for the following week. "This should process within 10 business days," Margaret said, sliding the paperwork across her desk. "And Sue, I'm glad you found this. Robert would have wanted you to be taken care of." From the bank, I drove to Sunset Gardens, a senior living community about 20 minutes away that I'd noticed during my apartment hunting. Not because I was old enough to need assisted living, but because I'd been impressed by their independent living units during a tour I'd taken months ago, back when I was just planning ahead. The community was beautiful. Well-maintained buildings, a central clubhouse, people my age walking dogs and tending small gardens. It felt like a place where I could have a life again, not just an existence. "We have a lovely one-bedroom unit available," said Patricia, the cheerful woman who showed me around. "It has a full kitchen, a screened porch, and you'd be part of our community. We have book clubs, game nights, day trips to the theater." I could afford it. With the insurance money, I could afford to live here comfortably for years, maybe even buy one of their smaller condos. I filled out an application and put down a deposit, my hands steady as I wrote the check. My last stop was the hardest one: the law office of Daniel Martinez, an elder law attorney I'd found online. I'd never thought I'd need a lawyer, Never imagined I'd be sitting in an office explaining how my own son had made me sleep in his garage after I'd given him my life savings. "Mrs. Mitchell," Daniel said after I'd told him the whole story, "what you're describing could constitute financial elder abuse. The fact that you were essentially coerced into giving up your housing proceeds and then provided inadequate living conditions creates a concerning pattern." He explained my options. I could file a complaint, potentially recover some of the money, or at minimum, create a legal record of what had happened. He also helped me understand my rights as someone who'd been financially exploited by family members. "I don't want to destroy my relationship with my son," I told him, "but I also can't continue living like this." "You don't have to choose between your dignity and your family," Daniel replied. "Sometimes, setting boundaries is the most loving thing you can do." I drove home, if I could still call it that, with a folder full of legal documents, a new bank account, and a move-in date 3 weeks away. Brian and Ashley had no idea that their accommodating, grateful houseguest was quietly dismantling the trap they'd built around her. And for now, I planned to keep it that way. 3 weeks passed, and I continued my morning routine of leaving the house each day, ostensibly to job hunt or run errands. Brian and Ashley seemed relieved by my absence, probably enjoying having their house to themselves without the awkward presence of the mother sleeping in their garage. If they noticed that I'd stopped asking about anything, stopped requesting kitchen privileges, stopped mentioning my discomfort, stopped trying to contribute to family conversations, they didn't comment on it. I think they assumed I'd finally learned my place. They had no idea I was spending my days finalizing my move, meeting with lawyers, and carefully documenting everything that had happened since I'd moved in. The camera on my phone had become my best friend. I had photos of the garage setup, complete with timestamps, pictures of the space heater Brian had given me, the air mattress on the concrete floor, the extension cord snaking across the garage. I'd even recorded some conversations, including one where Ashley complained to her sister about having to deal with Sue's neediness while I was supposedly napping in the garage. My notebook had become a detailed log: dates, times, conversations, incidents, the Memorial Day barbecue humiliation, every kitchen restriction, every time I'd been shushed or dismissed. The pattern was undeniable when laid out chronologically. Then Brian's carefully constructed world started developing cracks. It began with his work situation. The promotion Ashley had been so excited about came with increased pressure and unrealistic targets. Brian started coming home stressed, snapping at the kids, working late into the night on projects that never seemed to satisfy his new boss. "This is insane," I heard him telling Ashley one evening as I returned from another day of apartment hunting. "Henderson wants me to bring in 3 new major accounts by the end of the quarter, but he's cut my support staff in half." Ashley's response was sharp. "Then figure it out, Brian. We can't afford for you to lose this job, especially not now." A week later, Brian approached me as I sat in the living room reading. He looked tired, older somehow, with dark circles under his eyes. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something." I looked up from my book, a novel about a woman who'd inherited a fortune and used it to start over, and waited. "My company's going through some changes, and there's a possibility I might need to invest in some new equipment to keep my numbers up. It's a guaranteed return situation, but I need about $50,000 in startup capital." The old Sue would have immediately asked how she could help, would have started calculating whether she could liquidate her retirement accounts or find some other way to rescue him again. The new Sue just nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds challenging." Brian waited for more, his eyebrows raising slightly when I didn't continue. "So I was wondering if you might be able to help out again, just temporarily until the investment pays off." I closed my book and looked at my son. Really looked at him. "I'll think about it." The change in my tone was subtle, but unmistakable. Not eager agreement, not immediate problem solving, just a calm, non-committal response that made Brian shift uncomfortably. "It's kind of time-sensitive, Mom. I need to know by next week." "Then I'll let you know by next week." After Brian walked away, I noticed Ashley watching me from the kitchen doorway with an expression I hadn't seen before. Suspicion, as if she was trying to figure out what had changed about me, but couldn't quite put her finger on it. Over the next few days, I caught her studying me more frequently. When I'd leave for my daily outings, she'd ask more pointed questions. Where exactly are you going again? What kind of jobs are you looking at? Have you found any apartments yet? I'm exploring my options, I'd answer pleasantly, offering no details. My silence had become powerful, in a way my pleading never was. They sensed something different, something they couldn't control, and that made them nervous. Brian cornered me the following Thursday evening as I returned from what he thought was another fruitless day of job searching. Ashley was upstairs giving the kids their baths, and the house was filled with the familiar sounds of family life that I'd been excluded from for weeks. "Mom, I really need an answer about the loan," he said, blocking my path to the garage. "My boss is breathing down my neck, and this equipment investment could make the difference between keeping my job and losing it." I looked at my son standing there in his wrinkled work shirt, desperation creeping into his voice, and felt something settle into place inside my chest. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, without even realizing it. "Of course, Brian. Let's talk." I walked to the kitchen table and sat down, gesturing for him to join me. For the first time in weeks, I was claiming space in his house, without asking permission. Brian followed, looking relieved that I seemed willing to discuss his request. From my purse, I pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the table between us. "Before we talk about money, I have some things to show you." Brian glanced at the folder with mild curiosity as I opened it. The first thing he saw was a photograph. Me, sitting on the air mattress in his garage, looking exhausted and defeated. His face went pale. "Mom, what is this?" "Documentation," I said calmly, turning to the next page. "This is a timeline of my living conditions since I moved in. The restrictions placed on my use of common areas. The conversations I've overheard about my being unwelcome here." I showed him the photos methodically. The space heater that barely worked, the concrete floor where I'd been sleeping, the extension cord snaking across the garage. Each image was dated and time-stamped. Brian's mouth opened and closed, like he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. "There are also audio recordings," I continued, my voice steady and matter-of-fact, "including the conversation where Ashley told her sister that some people don't know when they're overstaying their welcome, and the Memorial Day barbecue where she publicly humiliated me about the garage arrangement." "Mom, I don't understand why you—" "I also have this," I interrupted, sliding a business card across the table. "Daniel Martinez, elder law attorney. He specializes in financial abuse cases involving family members." Brian picked up the card with shaking hands. "Financial abuse? Mom, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that I gave you $340,000 to save your house, and in return, you made me sleep in your garage and treated me like a burden. Mr. Martinez says that constitutes exploitation of a vulnerable adult." Ashley appeared in the doorway, having heard our voices. Her eyes immediately fixed on the folder, the photos spread across her kitchen table. "What's going on here?" she demanded. I turned to face her with a smile that felt genuinely peaceful for the first time in months. "I'm moving out, Ashley. I found a lovely place at Sunset Gardens Senior Community. I'll be gone by Saturday." "You found an apartment?" Brian asked, confusion mixing with his panic. "How can you afford—" "I found a life insurance policy from your father that I'd never claimed. $150,000. Enough to start over properly." The silence in that kitchen was profound. I could see Brian's mind racing, trying to understand how his controlled, grateful mother had suddenly become this composed woman with legal representation and an exit strategy. "About that loan you need," I said, closing the folder. "The answer is no, but I think you should read this first." I handed him Robert's letter. As Brian opened it and began reading his father's words about honoring and treasuring me, I saw his face crumble. "Mom," he whispered, "I never meant for things to—" "Yes," I said quietly, "you did." I stood up, tucked the folder under my arm, and headed toward the garage. for the last time. 2 days after our kitchen confrontation, Daniel Martinez called me with news that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've been doing some research on your son's financial situation, and I need you to sit down for this conversation." I was in my new apartment at Sunset Gardens, surrounded by boxes, but feeling more at home than I had in months. "What did you find?" "Your son never used your money for the mortgage." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "I ran a property search and checked public records. There was never a foreclosure notice on Brian's house. The mortgage payments have been current for the past 2 years. In fact, they refinanced 6 months ago, and their payments actually decreased." I sank into my new chair, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "That's impossible." "He was crying, Daniel. Ashley was crying. They said they were going to lose everything." "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you something important. Did you ever see the actual foreclosure notice? Did you verify the debt with the mortgage company directly?" The truth hit me like ice water. I'd never asked to see paperwork. I'd never verified anything. My son had called me sobbing, and I'd rushed to save him without question, because that's what mothers do. "Oh my God," I whispered. "If the money didn't go to the mortgage, where did it go?" "That's what I've been investigating. Based on financial records I was able to access through the abuse case filing, it appears your son invested the money in cryptocurrency. Specifically, something called SafeMoon, a digital currency that's lost about 90% of its value since March. My $340,000 had been gambled away on internet money that no longer existed." "He lied to me," I said, the words coming out strangled. "He made me think they were losing their house. He made me think his children would be homeless." "It gets worse, Mrs. Mitchell. I also found records showing that Brian has been taking cash advances on credit cards to cover the losses, and he owes approximately $180,000 across multiple cards. He's been juggling minimum payments for months. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Not only had Brian lied about the foreclosure, but he'd taken my entire life savings and lost it in some get-rich-quick scheme. Then, he'd watched me sleep in his garage while he figured out how to ask me for more money to cover his new debts. What are my options? Because he obtained the money through fraud, lying about the purpose, we can pursue criminal charges for elder abuse and financial exploitation. We can also file for restitution, which means he'd be legally required to pay you back." That afternoon, Daniel filed a police report and a civil suit. By evening, 2 officers were at Brian's door with a warrant for financial records and a summons. Ashley called me that night screaming, "Sue, what have you done? The police were here. They seized Brian's computer and all our financial records. They're talking about fraud charges." "I found out about the cryptocurrency, Ashley." The silence on the other end was deafening. "You knew, didn't you?" I continued. "You knew there was no foreclosure. You knew he gambled away my money and then made me sleep in your garage while he figured out how to scam more." "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," Ashley said, her voice smaller now. "The investment was supposed to pay off. We were going to pay you back with interest." "By making me live like an animal in your garage?" The next week, Brian was forced to sell his boat, his second car, and Ashley's jewelry to make the first restitution payment. Ashley filed for separation, taking the children to her mother's house. The justice was poetic. The son who'd treated his mother like garbage was now facing the consequences of his lies, while I sat in my beautiful new home, finally seeing him clearly for the first time. 3 months passed before Brian showed up at my door. I was watering the small herb garden I'd planted on my screened porch when I heard the tentative knock. Through the frosted glass, I could see a familiar silhouette, but this version of my son looked diminished somehow, shoulders hunched, head down, like he'd been carrying a weight too heavy for him. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. Brian had lost at least 20 pounds. His face was gaunt, and his eyes were red-rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights and impossible stress. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly, his voice cracking on the second word. "Hello, Brian." I didn't invite him in immediately. I just stood there, studying this man who'd caused me so much pain, feeling a curious sense of detachment. 3 months ago, seeing him in distress would have sent me into immediate caretaker mode. Now I simply waited to see what he wanted. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Please?" I stepped aside and gestured him into my living room. He looked around at my new space, the comfortable furniture I'd chosen, the photos of Robert, and happier times with family, the books I was finally reading for pleasure again, and I saw something like wonder in his eyes. "This place is beautiful, Mom. You look really good." I settled into my favorite chair and watched him perch nervously on the edge of my couch. "Thank you. I'm very happy here. Ashley left me," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out like he couldn't hold them back. "She took Emma and Jake to her mother's house in Colorado. She filed for divorce last week." I nodded but didn't respond. The old Sue would have immediately offered comfort, would have made excuses for him, would have asked what she could do to help. This Sue simply listened. "I lost my job," he continued, his voice getting smaller. "The legal troubles, the garnishments for your restitution payments. My boss said it was too much of a distraction. I can't find work anywhere. Everyone in town knows what happened." Brian started crying then, not the manipulative tears I now recognized from his foreclosure phone call, but the raw, ugly sobbing of a man whose world had completely collapsed. "I'm living in a studio apartment above the pizza place on Main Street. I can barely afford that. I eat ramen noodles for dinner and I haven't seen my kids in 6 weeks because I can't afford the plane ticket to Colorado." He looked up at me with desperate eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. The cryptocurrency thing was supposed to be a sure bet. I was going to surprise you with all the money I'd made, maybe even buy you a nice condo somewhere." I let the silence stretch between us, watching him squirm under the weight of his own consequences. "I know I don't deserve it," he whispered, "but I don't have anyone else. Ashley won't take my calls. Her family hates me. My friends won't even look at me. You're all I have left." There it was, the real reason for his visit. Not genuine remorse, but need. I was his last option, his final safety net, the person he could always count on to rescue him from his own bad decisions. The old Sue would have opened her checkbook and her heart, grateful just to have her son speaking to her again. "Brian," I said gently, "I love you. I will always love you because you're my son. But I won't be anyone's backup plan anymore." I leaned forward slightly, meeting his eyes directly. "You're welcome to visit me here on Sundays if you can treat me with respect. We can have dinner, we can talk, we can work on rebuilding our relationship. But I won't be rescuing you from consequences you created for yourself." His face crumpled. "But Mom, I don't know what else to do." "Then I suggest you figure it out," I replied calmly, the same way I had to. 6 months later, I'm sitting on my screened porch on a Sunday morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold over Sunset Gardens. My coffee is still steaming in the mug Robert gave me for our 20th anniversary, and I have a new novel open in my lap. Something I never had time for when I was busy rescuing everyone else from their problems. The sound of laughter drifts from the community center, where my neighbor Margaret Chen is teaching her Tai Chi class. In an hour, I'll join the book club that meets in the library, where 12 brilliant women discuss literature and life with the kind of sharp wit that comes from surviving decades and refusing to be invisible. My phone buzzes with a text message, and I smile when I see it's from Emma. Ashley eventually allowed the children to have my phone number, and now I get regular updates about their new life in Colorado. "Grandma Sue, I lost my first tooth. Mom says I can call you tonight to tell you about the tooth fairy. I miss you. Love, Emma. P.S. Jake drew you a picture of a dragon." These messages have become the bright spots in my weeks. My grandchildren know where to find me now. Know that I live in a beautiful place where they're always welcome. Know that their grandmother values herself enough to demand respect from the people who claim to love her. Brian still visits occasionally, usually on Sundays as I'd suggested. Our relationship is different now, more honest, less desperate. He's working 2 part-time jobs and living in that studio apartment, slowly paying back what he owes me. Sometimes I see glimpses of the boy I raised, especially when he talks about missing his children. But I don't rescue him. I don't offer money or solutions or a place to crash when things get difficult. I listen, I offer emotional support, and then I let him figure out his own life. It's the hardest kind of love, but it's also the most honest. "How do you do it, Sue?" my friend Patricia asked me last week as we walked around the community pond. "How do you keep loving someone who hurt you so badly?" I'd thought about that question for a long time before answering. I learned that love isn't about how much you sacrifice. It's about how much you respect yourself and demand that others respect you too. Ashley sends me Christmas cards now, polite updates about the children's school activities and her new job. I think she understands, in a way she couldn't before, that the woman who'd seemed so accommodating and grateful was actually someone she should have been grateful to have in her life. I think about the woman I was 6 months ago, sleeping on a concrete floor, eating crackers for dinner, begging for scraps of consideration from people who should have been honoring my sacrifices. That woman seems like a stranger to me now, someone I might pity but barely recognize. The doorbell rings, and I know it's my Sunday dinner companion, Dr. William Harper, a retired professor who moved in 2 buildings over and makes me laugh until my sides ache. We're taking things slowly, enjoying each other's company without the desperate need that characterized so many relationships in my past. As I get up to answer the door, I catch my reflection in the porch window. The woman looking back at me has bright eyes and straight shoulders, someone who knows her worth and isn't afraid to demand it be acknowledged. My garage days taught me that sometimes the people who claim to love us are the ones who hurt us most. But they also taught me something more important. It's never too late to remember who you are. And I'd rather be alone and valued than surrounded by people who see me as convenient. That lesson was worth everything I lost to learn it.